I look around and, of course, have seen now we're beginning our 20th anniversary this year, right, as the Montfort Academy. And I was just doing a count from the yearbooks and saw that we had, over the years, 97 teachers, right? 97 teachers over those 20 years, which is really extraordinary. And I never cease to be amazed at the tremendous achievements and the lives of the teachers, including those who are here with us right now this year. So there are, Mr. Torelli, of course, is a Third Order Franciscan. Others on the faculty are lawyers, musicians, pretty accomplished musicians, professional weight trainers, published scientists, authors, and others. So you may know your teachers really more on what they're teaching you in the classroom, but their lives behind the classroom and out of the classroom and all the way in time, back in time, until they got to the point where they're here sharing with you, they're pretty accomplished people. And so I would encourage you to really get to know your teachers and everything that they've done. Because if there's one thing about Montfort teachers, they love sharing their lives with you. They love sharing their knowledge with you. All you have to do is ask and engage. And in a way, we of course take great joy in that because it's all part of our vocation of teaching. Right? There's a vocation of teaching, and every one of the teachers here really shares a common vision in education. And that's a little bit about what today's convivium is about. Now, behind the scenes, too, whether it's in the faculty room or whether it's occasionally on the roof or at one of our homes, right, we get together as faculty members. We love one another. We love one another's company. We love the conversation that we have with one another. That's the way that we get to know and build that mortar, right, among ourselves. And the more and more that gets built, the more and more we can give to you as well, because we share ideas, right? We share, how do we reach this student? How do we reach that student? How do we communicate this? What is it that we should be communicating to you? So, in the truest sense of the word, convivium, right, from Latin, who knows every hand should be raised, right? Who knows what that means? Convivium, convivere. Well, all hands should be raised, right? Con means everyone, vivere, to live, right? Living together. And right now, we are living together, and as a family, we will be sharing together. And so anytime we have an opportunity for teachers to come here and to share with you, it's a great opportunity and a great occasion. So I'd like to highlight, in particular, one of our faculty members, Mr. Friddle. Mr. Friddle had the opportunity to write a paper, okay, on education, a particular view of education. He had the opportunity to submit that paper to an international organization, which he will talk more about, and it was accepted. So it was this international organization that invited him to come and to share that paper with all the scholars of that organization. That's a pretty big deal if you are invited by colleagues to come and to present something that you've written. And so I was struck by this, but I knew about it in August already, and said, one day, let's really see if you could present that paper also to the kids here, and maybe we could have some sort of discussion around it. So Mr. Friddle will speak in particular about a saint. His name is St. Thomas More. But as all saints, like you learned from Father Sorgi, they don't walk around the earth with, halos. And I mean, they're very real people going through very real life experiences. And in this particular case, it's St. Thomas More. all of you, perhaps with the exception of the freshmen, should know who St. Thomas More is because you read a book over the summer going into your sophomore year called, anyone? Excellent, A Man for All Seasons, which highlights the life of St. Thomas More. Well, St. Thomas More wrote a book called Utopia. Anybody know etymologically what utopia means? No? Not? Okay, Mr. Marilla, please explain.
It means no place.
No place. But what do we kind of in common language know it as? The perfect place. But the perfect place does not exist on earth. But yet, we as human beings, particularly we as teachers vis-a-vis you, the students, have an opportunity to get closer and closer and closer to perfection. So even though utopia is no place, it doesn't exist, it really is potentially the aim, depending on how it's defined, the aim, the end towards which we go, right? The perfection. And so Mr. Friddle will speak a little bit on that, views of education in the utopia, and then we, as his colleagues, will engage in debate. Listen carefully, make mental notes, because we would like you to participate as well, right? Even if you hold an entirely different opinion, I think each of you, because you are at such an academy as Montfort, has very strong opinions of what education should be. Each of you has very deliberately chosen a classical curriculum, right, for yourselves, and there must be a reason behind that. Not coincidentally, Mr. Friddle's paper is called Curriculum Wars. And so, potentially, there may be a little battle up here, depending on the ideas that we hold, and maybe there'll be a little battle back and forth. And that's what I hope this will be as we come through a little bit of a dialectic to a conclusion. So with that, Mr. Friddle.
Thank you, Mr. Greco. I should mention that utopia begins with a U, meaning no, and then topia, topos, place. But it sure does sound a lot like utopia with an EU, good place. So it's deceiving. Utopia sounds like a good place, but it's actually no place. So that's just to back up what Mr. Greco pointed out. There is no perfect good place. It's no place. But you are here at the Montfort Academy in 2021, which is a classic, the Montfort Academy is a classical school where you have read in the summer going into your sophomore year, A Man for All Seasons, a play by Robert Bolt about the life and martyrdom of a great saint. In that play, you see Thomas More as a great statesman, an obedient subject to the king, a humble saint, and a brave martyr. And although he's greatly known today for his patriotism and sanctity, when he was alive, he was actually more well known as a scholar and an educator. In fact, he attributes his wealth and his health, his honor and his virtue, and his abilities for friendship and leadership to his education. Now, I wrote an academic paper on Thomas More, and I won't bore you by reading it out, but I will share with you some of his ideas and vision of what an education should be, something that he spent his life pursuing himself and giving to others. And truly, this education, which he gained for himself and gave to us, is the reason why his best friend, Erasmus, says that he is a man for all seasons. Thomas More's education began in London's finest grammar school, St. Antony's. Here, the young Thomas learned to read, write, speak, and listen through the arts of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, which you all progress through in your freshman, sophomore, and junior years. And he also learned to measure, calculate, and exchange through the arts of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, which you all progress through from your freshman to senior year. And his studies sure do sound a lot like what you go through here at Montfort. Now, Thomas More's father soon saw his son's remarkable gifts of memory, wit, and understanding. So he placed the 11-year-old Thomas More under the tutelage of the Cardinal of London, John Morton. Thomas observed this saintly and wise Cardinal Morton shepherd the flock of London and fight off the wolves of flattering politicians and heretical theologians. The cardinal saw promise in young Thomas, and especially in his good humor. There's a funny story about St. Thomas More when he was a young lad, and the cardinal invited a number of actors into his residence. And the actors were short one player. So young Thomas, 11, 12 years old, immediately stands up and joins the troupe. And improvising and remembering lines from his beloved Chaucer and Plutarch, he took part in the play with great humor, and it was so remarkable. It was able to be remarked upon that Morton saw promise in this young man. So recognizing his talent, the cardinal convinced Thomas More's father to send him to the University of Oxford. Guess what age he was? Our freshmen here are what, turning 14? St. Thomas More entered the University of Oxford at age 13. He was brilliant. When he completed his philosophical and theological studies there, he took some time to discern his own vocation and test his character to see if he could live up to the calling that God gave him. So what did he do? He lived with Carthusian monks for some time, praying about God's will and his mission. And although he saw the beauty of the monastic life and the contemplative life, he also saw the need for virtuous men in civic society, and that if all of your virtuous men are leaving society, then how are we supposed to sanctify this world? After a long time of prayer, he determined that his vocation was marriage. Ultimately, he determined this, but he also resolved to continually improve his relationship with God. And so he committed himself to a plan of daily prayer, sacraments, and mortification. Starting at the age of 16, the age of many of our juniors, Thomas wore an uncomfortable hair shirt underneath his coat in order to master his wild passions. And he wore this hair shirt until his death 40 years later. He fasted regularly, prayed daily, and he guarded his tongue constantly against gossip and uncharitable speech, until he finally completed his studies at Oxford at the age of 17. Although Thomas More finished his formal education, he afterwards began his pursuit of lifelong learning. He always knew that he studied in order to serve the church and his country. Even though he was brilliant, at the age of 20, Thomas More created a 20-year plan of studies to train himself in the virtues and skills required to serve his country and church with his talents. By nurturing his natural gifts, he could give more than what others could who despised learning and despised study. Here we see a perfect combination of humility and magnanimity, self-knowledge and self-gift. And although he could read and write both in English and Latin, he saw that a large portion of the best literature and philosophy was written in Greek. So he set out to learn that ancient language in a very creative way. He challenged his best friend, Erasmus, to a learning competition. Whoever could learn Greek in 2 years faster wins. And after this mutually beneficial competition, around the age of 22, he mastered Greek, to the point where he translated Plato's Republic twice, once out of Greek into Latin and second out of Greek into English before he wrote Utopia. With Greek under his belt, he sought to improve his ability to speak eloquently. So he set out to write 250 epigrams, some of which are translations and others of which are original. He was so eloquent, and he developed his ability to speak so well, that when Martin Luther's heresies caught fire in England, the Bishop of London asked Thomas More to defend the church and attack Luther with his eloquence. Within 5 years, Thomas More wrote 10 books, some of them spanning over 1,000 pages. Those of you seniors who are writing your papers, how difficult it is to write two. Thomas More wrote 10 books in 5 years defending the church. But we were getting ahead of ourselves. At the age of 23, the budding Thomas More began delivering lectures at the most respected and prestigious law society in London, Lincoln's Inn, where he developed a mature understanding of politics and Christianity. Afterwards, he was elected to Parliament, to his first public office 10 years after that, at the age of 35. And from there, he ascended all the way to the highest office in the land under the king, Lord Chancellor. And because of his reputation for virtue and wisdom, Thomas More became important, while many of his contemporaries also sought positions of importance through different means, bribery and vice. During his political career, Thomas More wrote his most important works on education, in part because he was in charge of his children's education, but also in part, and more importantly, he saw education as the most important political act. So he dedicated himself to educating his children. It was said that his home was a gymnasium for Christian virtue, right? Mr. San Marco leads the exercises and you grow stronger. Well, Thomas More's home was a gymnasium like that, except in virtue. Excuse me. Now, every aspect of their family life in the More household aimed at the edification of his family, from the beautiful paintings on the wall to the home library of great literature, to the meal times where they practiced refinement both in manners and in wit. And while at court, Thomas More's children, including the youngest, wrote him an endearing letter every day telling him about what they were learning and reading. To make these letters of love more formative, Thomas asked his children to write these letters in Latin, only after they first wrote it in English and translated it into Latin. He would also give corrections to their letters and send those back to his children. Even though his public duties drew him away from home, Thomas More hired tutors in Henry VIII's royal court to tutor his children, and not only his sons, but also his daughters. At the time, it was common for a woman not to receive an education, but Thomas More insisted, education leads you to happiness, so I want to give that to my daughters. And the brightest of whom, of course, is Margaret. Margaret More was endowed with brilliance as her father was. One of the letters that Thomas wrote about Margaret went to Margaret's tutor, William Gannell, and it's perhaps his clearest articulation of the purpose of a Christian classical education. He begins the letter by praising Gannell for tutoring his children because their learning is evident in their elegant letters. Surprisingly, Thomas More takes pleasure in Margaret's virtue more than in her intelligence. He writes that education should put virtue in the first place and learning in the second. In other words, he says that Margaret's moral virtues are more important than her intellectual ones. Why? Shouldn't we care more about improving our head more than our heart? He answers that question. It is better to be good and dumb than smart and proud. For learning, when it is not united with a good life, is nothing else than splendid and notorious infamy. How are we then to acquire this kind of learning? The liberal arts. Elsewhere, he says that the liberal arts not only perfect your judgment, but also prepare you and free you to pursue higher things, like philosophy, theology. These studies, he points out, shouldn't aim at praise, which would be vanity, but they should aim at utility, which is charity. Learning is useful. In fact, he says, the most useful of things. Thomas showed that learning is useful himself, as seen in his abilities to govern well. After this introduction, Thomas warns Margaret's tutor, William Gannell, against the greatest enemy in any educational enterprise, pride. He asks him to warn my children to avoid the precipices of pride and haughtiness, and to walk in the pleasant meadows of modesty, not to be dazzled at the sight of gold, not to lament that they do not possess what they erroneously admire in others, not to think more of themselves for gaudy trappings, nor less for the want of them, neither to deform the beauty that nature has given them by neglect, nor to try to heighten it by artifice. In other words, the virtuous person must not become proud of their own virtue. In pride's place, Thomas encourages Gannell to esteem whatever may teach them piety towards God, charity towards all, and humility in themselves. This triple command defeats the temptation of pride in an education. And what is the fruit of these efforts to grow in learning and virtue? Thomas says that they will receive from God the reward of an innocent life, and in the assured expectation of it, will view death with no horror, and meanwhile, possessing solid joy, will neither be puffed up by empty praise, nor dejected by evil tongues. That is the fruit of this kind of education, and that is what we are aiming for. St. Thomas finishes this letter returning to the danger of pride. He asks if Gannell would sing this song to them and repeat it and beat it into their heads, that vainglory is a despicable thing and to be spat upon. He signs off his letter to his children, who are more dear to me by nature and still more dear to me by learning and virtue, and will become most dear to me by the advance in their learning and virtue. Put simply, he loves his children because they are his, but he will love them more because they are virtuous and learned. This letter is little known by hardly anyone, but it sheds light on the purpose and consequences of a Catholic classical education. If you don't trust me, just look at the life of St. Thomas More and his death to see that he shunned the proud and feared no punishment because he rejoiced in his clean conscience and hoped in the providence of God. His king, Henry VIII, did not share that clean conscience with St. Thomas More. Henry sought an unlawful divorce that the Pope would not grant an absolution for. And full of lust and taken with rage, he separated the Church of England from the Church of Rome and commanded that all officials swear an oath of loyalty to him as the new sovereign head of the Church. Thomas resigned the day after this was declared. Although he remained silent when asked for his opinion on the matter of the divorce, Henry's henchman and the replacement of More as Lord Chancellor, Oliver Cromwell, imprisoned Thomas. And while Cromwell interrogated him in the Tower of London, Thomas replied to his accusations of treason, "I do nobody harm. I say none harm. I think none harm, but wish everybody good. And if this be not enough to keep a man alive, in good faith I long not to live." In the trial that followed, his best friends testified against him, and one of them, Richard Rich, went so far as to lie under oath in order to convict Thomas of treason. On the way to the scaffold, where the executioner sharpened his knife, Thomas was led through a crowd of onlookers when his beloved daughter, Margaret, burst through the guards, embraced her father, and kissed him for the last time. And before the guards yanked her back, Thomas said that he never before has loved her so much as he did then. He joked walking up the steps to his death that while he may need help getting up onto the stage, his head would need no help coming down. This death joke about his head getting lopped off just shows his ultimate detachment from his body, worldly goods, his courage in the face of evil, his calmness in the midst of friends turned traitor, and his joy in virtue and his hope in heaven. Then, kneeling down, looking out over the crowd of curious Londoners, many of whom were his friends and many of whom were his family, Thomas spoke his last, "I die the king's good servant and the king's first." As his life shows, Thomas More's learning and virtue helped him serve the church in England. As his death shows, his education left him joyful in his innocence and unafraid of death. He truly was a man for all seasons.
It seems that there's, St. Thomas More may have been influenced a lot by Plato, and of course doing translations and really studying, you can't help but being influenced too. So Plato, of course, talks about good character, right, as the aim of education. Forming character, particularly in the case of young and tender things, right, in their early years of formation. But yet, St. Thomas More thinks, too, that education, like you said, is the ultimate political act. But yet, I think hardly anyone here would disagree that politics is ugly, right? Politics is corrupt, right? Politics has so many unsavory people. So if the aim is good character, and politicians, so politics is not necessarily corrupt. The politicians in politics tend to be corrupt. How could education be the ultimate political act when, like St. Thomas More, if you make your way into political life as an innocent and good character person, you get your head chopped off? Anyway.
I'll take that.
Go ahead.
Is this working?
Yes.
Right. So I think you need to define the word political here, because when we say that we're political, we think of politicians, the news, cable media. Whereas when we look at its root, the polis is the city. It's the community. And so I think Mr. Fiddle could comment on this more, but when he talks about it being the ultimate political act, I think what he means is that education is particular in an expression of a particular polis, of a particular community. And so the education of one polis, of one community, is going to be different in order to emphasize different things than of another polis, different thing. for example, one would consider maybe the Japanese educational system. The Japanese educational system is extremely good at teaching science and math. Okay, there's a very, very strong emphasis on that. It's very important for Japan's economy. Right, that's a big factor there. And so their educational system, their political educational system, if you want to call it that, reflects that and has been honed to bring out that skill. Also in Japan, you may not see the same emphasis on the liberal arts as you might find in certain communities in America or in certain parts of England in Thomas More's time. So you look at these different polis, these different communities, they're going to emphasize different things and have different expressions. Perhaps that is the use of the word political that Thomas is getting at.
Yeah. No, it's a great question, one that Thomas More himself grappled with, and all the Renaissance scholars also grappled with. And there's a definite shift in trying to form the best society to trying to form the best soul. So the shift went from focusing on statecraft towards soulcraft. And why was that? Well, as much as you can form the best political structure, constitution, and policies, if you don't imbue that skeleton with good flesh, good people, good souls, then it will be for naught. So I think what is in the phrase education is the most political act? Well, if politics is directed towards the virtue of the citizens, then you want a virtuous leader, someone who is going to be like a fountain pouring forth good flowing water unto the citizens. So I think that education, which is focused more on the soul, sets up politics to thrive. If you have bad education, you're going to have bad politics.
Yeah. This microphone still working?
Yep.
You'll hear?
Yeah, put it more to
all right. And in fact, the founding fathers often said that, democracy is really important. We love democracy. But democracy doesn't just function on its own, because nowadays sometimes a lot of people think, democracy isn't working that well. That's because the founding fathers didn't say democracy or republic is good on its own. They said democracy and republic works well with a well-educated citizenry who has the right values and has the right understanding. So, yes, we want people to be able to express their opinions and to be able to vote, but if people aren't well-educated, then the whole system falls apart.
But if that good education is premised, which I think it is right here, if it's aimed at the soul, of course, implies a very firm belief that there is a soul to educate in the first place, which stems from a belief in God, the creator of souls. We're very lucky. God's right here, right? I mean, physically present. But he's being taken out of the classrooms all over the country. He's being taken out of the courtrooms all over the country. He's being taken out of news reports all over the country. I mean, we can't even talk about God. So how does a modern society talk about God and talk about an education whose aim is to form a soul?
Well, I think naturally you have a more complete understanding of the soul and what it is and how it relates to God if you believe in God. But I think most people who don't believe in God still believe that there's such a thing as right and wrong, good and bad. When I was growing up in the 1980s, I would still believe there's such a thing as virtue and being honest, being thoughtful, being kind. So I think maybe we could do it more fully with the full truth. But I think if you're trying to teach somebody who's not religious and form them to be better, they still don't understand.
So you're an optimist.
Maybe in this case.
Michael?
So what's the percentage? Yeah, what about, so the instance with St. Thomas More, right? The idea that he is properly educated, right? He is properly educated, this isn't good for him, but he clashes, right, with those around him. The state, which is not made up of as many, or maybe very few others who are also well-educated, right? I mean, how is his life going to be a model for how we want to live when these, I guess, clashing understandings of education are the case, which we do find, as I think Mr. Greco and Mr. Goswami are getting at. That this is the case, right? Yes, education is a political act, or the most important political act, right? But what happens when everyone in the state doesn't really recognize this, and there's conflict.
I might add that, the moment you remove God from an education, you've removed the keystone, kind of holding it up. Just because there's disagreement over who God is and how you should worship Him, doesn't mean that you stop educating about Him. If we all disagreed on the nature of man, does that mean we stop talking about man? Just because, it was common in schools in early America where they had a Bible class, and that was in your average public school. And it would be shameful if you didn't know your Bible through and through, and have lines memorized and be able to deliver. So, our theology is called the Queen of the Sciences for a very good reason.
And at a place like Montfort, it remains the queen of the sciences too, which is why you take 4 full years, which is why we're here in this church twice a week, why you take a class called chivalry, right, to get to the good manners also, in part, to what Mr. Frickle said, and the same thing with the Christian womanhood, particularly using Margaret as an example, right? And St. Thomas More has a very real love and concern for his daughter. So you have formation of soul and formation of conscience. How does education, particularly here at Montfort, for example, at you as teachers, how do you think that affects, or how do we talk about formation of conscience? What is it that the kids learn in terms of a well-formed conscience?
It's the question. And it's a question that most educators actually don't ask. Right? Your average school isn't going to ask that question. And I think it's a testament to the uniqueness of the school that we are asking that question. But everyone has a conscience, and it's either poorly formed or well-formed. And you form it through good principles, right? Studying your catechism or your ethics. But it's also formed through, you might say, proper images of the good and noble life. So through poetry and history and art and music, all of that fashions your moral imagination to see reality as it is, and its desirability.
So I think Mr. Frickle mentioned in the talk the idea that Thomas More said something like he'd rather have good but dumb students than learned and proud, right? So we can relax, we just want them to be good. But I think the very difficult thing is how do you make people good, right? So how do you develop this conscience, right? I think what you're getting at is, through exposure, maybe, right? Just through sharing and enjoying with students good books, good music, right? And I'm not sure really what else, what beyond this can we do to form consciousness, form souls. But this is the first step, at least, for me.
Yeah, formation in virtue is certainly one of the hardest things, but it's also one of the most worthwhile endeavors. I think that every single challenge is an opportunity to grow in some virtue. and we're constantly challenged. And challenged poorly used is anxiety. Challenged well used is enthusiasm. So the more you thrive on challenge, the more you grow in virtue, specifically moral virtue. So if you notice, good students who grow up well and virtuous thrive on challenge. When they're offered a challenging assignment, they accept it, embrace it, see the higher purpose behind it, and ride with it. Other students who don't see that complain, which is a consequence of anxiety. So I think challenge, which we're constantly presented with, not only in the classroom, also in sports, also in family life, also in work, all of that provides an occasion for virtue growth. Now it's really difficult, and you need the encouragement, and that often comes from a mentor, which is one reason why I think teachers, they have many different hats. They're coaches, they're mentors, they sometimes act as parents and guides. And so they can provide that kind of guidance where challenge turns into an opportunity for growth.
I would add to that too, that when talking about forming a conscience, there's also an aesthetic aspect to that. And C.S. Lewis talks about this in a book called The Abolition of Man, a very, very good book that everyone should read. And he talks about this modern phenomenon, what he called men without chests. That doesn't mean they don't work out. What that means is that even before something, you intellectually respond to something, but there's also kind of a, lack of a better word, a visceral response that you have to something. Some of the freshmen today in the literature class, I was talking about how the Greeks would never show violence on a stage, right? Because they thought that if people were to view violence in theater, they would become basically numb to violence and they wouldn't respond to it, they wouldn't respond to actual true acts of violence. So there's an assumption there that when you see an injustice happening, or when you see violence happening to some person, there's a correct response that you should have. You should look upon it and see that it's a bad thing. Likewise, when you hear a piece of beautiful music, like the music of J.S. Bach, for example, whether or not it's to your taste is one question, but a properly formed person will react to beautiful music in a positive way, will react to beautiful music and be able to recognize its beauty and not be necessarily bored by it or disinterested by it or moved by it. And the converse of that being that if you do listen to the music of J.S. Bach and you think it's ugly or you think it's hideous, you are wrong. Okay? It's not a matter of taste. You have not understood. The problem isn't the music. The problem is with the hearing. So part of this, the formation of conscience is, what to use C.S. Lewis's term, it's developing a chest. It's developing a heart that responds to reality, as you're talking about, in an appropriate way, in a fitting way, which is a very difficult thing to do. It's a journey of a lifetime.
So do you respond to anything to add?
No, I guess I just want to second. I really like the way Mr. Friddle phrased it, that challenge used well to grow in virtue, or challenge used well leads to growth in virtue, and challenge used poorly leads to anxiety.
How many in here, no embarrassment or anything, have felt anxiety in the last week? Okay, right? That's at least half. How many have felt excitement over a challenge in the past week? Well, I could say that too. Right? All right, well, that's probably a good quarter of you, maybe a third of you. How many kids on the basketball team right now feel anxious for what's going to come in a few hours? But how many of you also feel excited for what's coming, right? So there is that kind of line there, or where you can, in your head, mentally, re-channel, right? And go from anxiety to real enthusiasm and embracing. And actually you have to do that, right? You're going to play well. You're going to be your best. You're going to have the best form. You're going to play beautifully, right? Because there's probably a certain art to the mechanism, to your emotions and everything that needs to be recognized and needs to be practiced over and over. So even in something like sports, there is an education, right, which is your training over and over for something like this. So I think that's really good and interesting. So we have only about 10 minutes or so. Any interaction from you? Any questions for us? For Mr. Friddle?
Can I first ask one thing?
Oh yes, go ahead.
Okay, so that's a good example of the basketball students. It's a challenge, but it's exciting. But that's because basketball is something that they want to do, they're excited that they chose to do.
Yeah.
What about if you have a challenge, and it's also not even a challenge that you want to do? Let's say, Mr. Friddle had to write this paper, but maybe he finds it exciting because he wanted to write on Thomas More. What if you have to write a paper and you're not even that excited about the topic of the paper, you don't even want to write it, and it's a challenge? How do you find excitement about that?
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yes, but it's especially difficult to find reasons for enthusiasm on challenges you don't see the benefit of. For example, the challenge every morning of getting up out of bed the moment your alarm goes off. It's difficult to see what's the benefit of this. It's just anxiety. Where's the enthusiasm? But then you could reason to yourself, well, there are great benefits from jumping up, right? You seize the day, you win that first battle. So by reasoning, and also by asking for other people's advice, you can find reasons that you first didn't see. So even though we're all presented with challenges we may not understand, we can go to people who have gone through those challenges and get their advice on how they thrived on it and why they thrived on it. So I think advice is really one of the ways to see reasons for excitement in any challenge.
I was doing some Christmas decorating over the weekend, and I came across a very old, probably from the 1950s, toy. And it's Santa Claus in bed. And there's an alarm clock. So you wind it up. And then the alarm clock stops, and then his hand keeps going. So Santa Claus hits the snooze. Can't muster that enthusiasm even to get up out of bed. So your example reminded me of that. It's a cute toy.
If I could respond.
Yeah, go ahead.
To Mr. Smalley's question. I would add that an educated, so faced with, for example, writing a paper on a topic you're not particularly hot about, an educated person will first of all be able to recognize the good thing in that topic, right? The good question in that topic, or the good thing needs to be pursued. And secondly, an educated person will be able to see the connection between that original topic and something else that they are interested in. Because all, St. John Henry Newman talks about this. All the different disciplines are basically these different ways of looking at the same reality that we all inhabit. So, maybe for example, astronomy is not my main thing, but I could, in fact, I am kind of interested in it, but assuming I'm not, I could still see, for example, connections to Greek philosophy, which I am interested in, or to, Christian ontology, Christian ideas of the universe, cosmology that they're interested in. And so you can tease something out of a topic that you do like. Right? If you're an educated person, you can see those connections.
Everyone, St. Augustine says, what? All
True.
is very good. What Mr. Rowe was just saying, everything that you're learning here is one facet, one aspect, one part of that reality. Any questions? Comments even? Yes, Rebecca.
So, I know you're saying that education it's education of the soul. So, the idea of the soul is from God. So if you're not educated around God, are you not well educated?
What a profound question.
Yeah, it's a good question. And God has made many saints of people who are not educated, right? St. Isidore the farmer was illiterate, never read a book in his life, but just listened to preachers tell him about the gospel, and he became a saint. So you can still achieve goodness without learning. But learning sure does help in that pursuit. So I think, it is still, when you're learning, there is still very much a learning of the soul, although you can still, and it is the natural route. Learning is the natural route for growth in virtue. And to not take the opportunity to learn would be almost presumptuous. Say, God, give me the grace without my effort. But learning is the path that He's laid down for us for that growth. So I think to realize that grace builds upon nature, and learning perfects nature, so that way you can be docile, receive and accept grace, and use it in the way the martyrs did, St. Thomas More did.
But I think Rebecca's not asking if education is necessary to seeking God. She asked, is God necessary for good education? Is that right? Yeah.
Well, I think whether you go to a Catholic school or not, you're still learning about reality, right? I think that there, just like Mr. Friddle said about the definition of utopia, there is a perfection. It probably doesn't exist on earth, but you can ever move closer and closer. So if you have an understanding of, let's say, God as the creator, and that His creation has many aspects to it, including us as humans and our interaction with one another, the history, the literature we've written, the art that we've created, etc. It's a more perfect education because you have God as the end, right? And your relationship with Him, the formation of the soul. It doesn't mean that an education that doesn't have that explicitly as its end is a bad education. It means it's an incomplete education. That's how I would say that. Right?
But I think maybe a very good education without God in it is actually probably much better than, an education where you talk about God at its very core.
Correct. That's right. Anyone else? No? Yes. Who is that? Tom? No, Felon? Yeah, Felon.
So several of these philosophers, such as Plato, Aristotle.
Could you stand, Felon, and project a little bit more?
Some of these philosophers that we study for classical education, such as Plato and Aristotle, didn't necessarily believe in God, yet we use it for a basis in our classical education and our study of God. Why is that?
Very. You want to take that?
One of the ways that I would maybe also answer Rebecca's question, you compare it to like building something, like building a pyramid, right? So an education that doesn't recognize or draw on God. It's like you have a very full pyramid, but you don't have the very tipping top, right? So of course we read Plato and Aristotle, who, yes, admittedly don't come to the full truth of things, right? But they provide us with the foundation, right? They provide us with truth that allows us to go beyond this and to, with the scriptures, with the theologians, right, to complete and to consummate this knowledge. But they're still useful, they're still helpful, of course, because they contain truth.
What about notions of immaterial and material? That immaterial certainly can exist.
Right, of course.
And there can be a perfect immateriality, right?
So they lay the foundation for us, right? To begin thinking about this transcendence, right? Not a transcendent God for them, because they don't really have this, right? But transcendence as a concept, right? Thought.
I would add to that, Fedlin, the question you ask goes straight back to the earliest days of Christianity. That is, what is the relationship between the revealed truth of the gospel and the pagan world into which Christianity emerged? And the church father Tertullian talks about this idea, the spoliatio Egyptiorum, the despoiling of the Egyptians, that But the early church fathers could use the best of pagan philosophy and culture to enrich their theology. And you have to think, all these great church fathers, St. Augustine, Gregory of Nazianzus, Origen of Alexandria, every one of them is extremely well-versed in Greek philosophy and Greek culture and Roman literature and all these things. And so they use that in their development of the doctrines that we now use and profess in our belief in Christianity, right? So they took the best of it, as Mr. Vincenti was saying. They found truth in it, and then saw how revelation perfects that truth, okay? Completes the knowledge, okay? How God basically has intervened in history to complete that knowledge for us.
They're also extremely useful to see how far you can get with reason alone. You look at Aristotle and Plato, who did not have the benefit of Christianity and revelation, and they concluded there is one God, he's wise, he's good, and he created everything, and there are other attributes they found. And they got there with reason alone. So it's very helpful to see when you read Aristotle and Plato, how far can you get with reason alone? Well, let's look to Aristotle. He concluded there was one God. He is good. He's in control. He created everything. And you can get pretty far. So.
And likewise, without the reason, just like you had said, with St. Isidore, with St. Isidore, right, who had a very strong faith through listening, you could get very far with faith too. Right? Anyone else? The bell's about to ring. Yeah? Well, that was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Would you like to come and lead us in the Angelus before we all go outside and cheer our pastor?
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Eternal Father, I offer thee the body and blood, soul and divinity of thy dearly beloved Son, our Lord Jesus Christ.
Atonement for our sins and those of the world.
For the sake of his sorrowful passion.
Have mercy on us and on the whole world.
For the sake of his sorrowful passion.
Have mercy on us and on the whole world.
For the sake of his sorrowful passion.
Have mercy on us and on the whole world.
For the sake of his sorrowful passion.
Have mercy on us and on the whole world.
For the sake of his sorrowful passion.
Have mercy on us and on the whole world.
For the sake of his sorrowful passion.
Have mercy on us and on the whole world.
For the sake of his sorrowful passion.
Have mercy on us and on the whole world.
For the sake of his sorrowful passion.
Have mercy on us and on the whole world.
For the sake of his sorrowful passion.
Have mercy on us and on the whole world.
For the sake of his sorrowful passion.
Have mercy on us and on the whole world.
Holy God, Holy Mighty One, Holy Immortal One.
Have mercy on us and on the whole world.
Holy God, Holy Mighty One, Holy Immortal One.
Have mercy on us and on the whole world.
Holy God, Holy Mighty One, Holy Immortal One.
Have mercy on us and on the whole world.
Thus I trust in you. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay.